Let It Bleed is as raw, unguarded, brutal and honest as rock and roll should be, and arguably their darkest album. Let It Bleed captures this band at its devastating best, described by Rolling Stone as their nastiest masterpiece. It is an album full of bad news, from the apocalyptic shivers of Gimme Shelter, a song that identifies the counterculture as ultimately more terrifying than idyllic, described by Jagger in 1995 as an end-of-the-world song. We get the filthy strut of Live With Me and the twisted menace of Midnight Rambler, that blues epic where Mick warns of the monster coming for all December's children. These songs ooze doom, death, darkness and destruction. That is before we're offered any sense of transcendence, conjoined with the Chelsea drugstore's comings and goings and you can't always get what you want.
I saw her today at the reception.
It is an album of contrasts, as best Stones albums usually are. From the beautiful mandolin-infused treatment of Robert Johnson's Love in Vain to the heartfelt expression of betrayal in You've Got the Silver. Interestingly, the cake on the cover was actually prepared by Delia Smith. And the reverse of the LP shows the same record stack melange in a state of disarray. The working title for this album was actually Automatic Changer, and the artwork certainly reflects that. The foreboding atmospheres explored in this album is very much in keeping with the zeitgeist, where everything was unravelling after the flowery utopia of the Summer of Love. In fact, Stephen Davis said of this record, "No rock record before or since has ever so completely captured the sense of palpable dread that hung over its era." Let It Bleed reflects the socio-political turmoil on both sides of the Atlantic, including the assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy and Dr. Martin Luther King. There was also a feeling that this band didn't need to shimmy with Lucifer, as napalm was stripping the flesh from the bones of Southeast Asia. Overall, a horrid catalogue of society's descent into urban unrest and civil violence. Also, the spring student riots in France inspired a new sense of outrage, with barricade anthems like Street Fighting Man from the band's previous album, of course. And whereas before they were content to smirk over middle-class hypocrisy and toy with familiar sexual and romantic tropes, by the late 60s there was a moving away from the experimentation with psychedelia to the darkly sexual howl of R&B. An aesthetic that, in the words of one critic, turned the 1960s kaleidoscopic chaos into new realms of psychosexual frenzy. 50 years after its release, Let It Bleed seems as timelier as ever, as our world once more spirals out of control. Maybe we can hold this up as the ultimate rock and roll album for bleak times, and one that very much strikes the death knell of the 1960s. I mean, to quote Rob Sheffield's article, they dropped Let It Bleed in the final days of a decade that didn't turn out the way they or anyone else hoped. You Can't Always Get What You Want, Monkey Man, Midnight Rambler. These are warning shots, serving notice that the 60s dreams are about to cannonball into Brian Jones's swimming pool, never to return alive. Brian Jones sat in a corner and laid down a few haunting grace notes to a You've Got the Silver, Keith's great love song to Anita, a meagre contribution to this album. He was replaced, of course, by Mick Taylor, who also only plays on a couple of tracks on this album. Jones, who had recently bought A.N. Milne's house, only to die there surrounded by statues of Winnie the Pooh and Christopher Robin. That is after being dismissed from the band that he founded. The tribute in Hyde Park saw Jagger reading from Shelley's Adonais, whilst releasing Butterflies, no doubt to be trodden into the boards as a powdery mulch. Pete Townsend, speaking to the London Evening News, said of Brian Jones, "Well, today's a pretty normal day for Brian. He always seemed to be losing out one way or another. I used to see a lot of Stones' success lying with him, but the rest of the Stones never really dug him. He was always under some drug or another, a very druggy sort of person." Mick Taylor remembers their first rehearsals as really ragged, describing the band as sloppy and spontaneous. Of course, it was the gig where most agree the Stones were upstaged by King Crimson. as the Stones sounded ragged and ill-rehearsed for the most part. Bill Wyman said in his autobiography Stone Alone, "It was such a fabulous day. It all went like a dream, except we were out of tune. Couldn't help that because we tuned up in one of the air-conditioned caravans, and the only thing we could tune to was a harmonica because we didn't have tuners then. So we all got tuned up to the harmonica, and then we went out into the brilliant sunshine, and of course it changed all the tuning. So everybody was trying to tune to something. Mick Taylor was trying to tune to Keith, who was out of tune with me, and we were all out of tune with the piano." This is an album that builds upon the rock and blues feel of Beggar's Banquet, taking it into more demonically sexual territory. The Stones made Let It Bleed under a cloud of bad vibes. It's their Keefiest album, well, apart from Exile on Main Street, of course. Keith plays virtually all the guitars on this one. Of course, Brian Jones wasn't there to clutter up Keith's actions with all those dulcimers and marimbas. The drugs were getting uglier, as was the context. Riots, wars, not to mention assassinations, all just a shot away. And the harmonica-driven Midnight Rambler, which according to Keith Richards, the basic track of this was actually laid down in one take. And if you read his autobiography, he says it's pure Chicago blues. But nevertheless, it does see the album descend into murderous darkness, sex and violence that lurk beneath this stomping, four-square blues yop. The song is about Albert DeSalvo, who was responsible for a series of terrible murders in the early 60s. But the song is musically interesting as well, as it's quite compelling, as Richards attacks the chords, basing his whole phrasing around tension and release. And Jagger contributed those remarkable harmonic fills and that theatrical quality of his voice, ranging from quiet whispers to a kind of manic screaming in the blink of an eye. Beggar's Banquet and Let It Bleed are significant markers in this band's evolution, so certainly a long way from Get Off My Cloud to Gimme Shelter. Classic Rock said of this band at this juncture that they had in effect become delicious and diabolical harbingers of counterculture doom. This album is a dark offering. I mean, we do get that wonderful crescendo and you can't always get what you want, which seems to offer some notion of deliverance, albeit with a resigned shrug. Let It Bleed and Live With Me are infused with a garish sexuality, which is no doubt what we expect from this band, but they're juxtaposed with more delicate numbers like the aforementioned Robert Johnson cover Love in Vain, and of course Richards' You've Got the Silver. One critic has pointed out that tracks like Gimme Shelter, Midnight Rambler and Live With Me are testimonies to power and conquest. This album, from the frenzied wails of Mary Clayton to evocations of moonless nights and serial killers, all contribute to a heightened sense of dread. Certainly befitting the storm metaphor in Gimme Shelter. Of course, Creedence Clearwater Revival asked us if we were all prepared to die. But the Stones are pointing to an urban unravelling and moral reckoning. The music is dark and the vocals often slurred and subterranean, as Keith's guitar circles like a bird of prey over the corpse of the 1960s. And Mary Clayton, the gospel-trained backing singer that was drafted in for the session, she transports us into a hellish nightmare. The performance reflects the ever-important role of female vocals as part of the Stones' sonic palette. Gimme Shelter is a song that's built slowly from the tremolo guitar, bass and drums before Jagger's primal yowl. And that's not to forget, of course, Mary Clayton, who is spine-tinglingly good on this. Her voice is so powerful. I adore Richard's shimmering riffs as well, but it's her voice. It's absolutely chilling on this piece and adds to a sense of terror and dread apparent in every note. Glyn Johns said of her performance, "She was called very late at night, and being pregnant and already in bed, was singularly impressed at being disturbed at such a late hour. She had no idea who the Rolling Stones were and was reluctant to come. She was absolutely amazing. None of us had heard anything quite like what was produced that night. I practically had to stand her in another room. Her voice was so powerful. She did 3 amazing takes, stood there with her hair still in curlers, and then she went home." The dynamic for this album had already been well established by the Beggar's Banquet album, which saw Jagger and Richards adding heightened country and acoustic blues accents. And if I'm not mistaken, Beggar's Banquet was the first album produced by Jimmy Miller. Interestingly, Glyn Johns, in his autobiography, he talks about a significant leap in sound quality and a supple rhythmic feel which would prove common denominators for the albums all the way up to Exile on Main Street. On Beggar's Banquet, there are numbers that sort of cushion the fury of some of the songs on that album. And this album likewise, of course, Gimme Shelter, as I've said, is juxtaposed with delicate numbers like Love in Vain. And of course, Love in Vain veers from Johnson's tortured Delta blues with the assistance of Ry Cooder's tremulous mandolin. The Californian virtuoso's influence on the Stones cannot be understated. Of course, I believe it was Ry Cooder that actually introduced Keith Richards to open G tuning. Love in Vain segues into country honk, which recasts Honky Tonk Woman as a predatory character preying on a more bumptious country cousin of Jagger's more sated lover. Live With Me extends that cheerful carnality in an R&B romp, buttressed by Leon Russell's barrel house piano and muscular horn arrangement. Monkey Man has a shimmering jazz lounge quality, with Let It Bleed yet another celebration of sex, drugs and rock and roll. Then You've Got the Silver, which kind of brings the tempo back down again. Glyn Johns says he totally screwed up the mix, really, putting too much reverse echo on Richard's guitar, a mistake that saw him erasing Jagger's vocal. And with Jagger away in Australia filming Ned Kelly, it was left to Richards to record the lead vocal. However, according to Wikipedia, the story that Jagger's vocal was accidentally erased has been repeated by many since 1969, including engineer Glyn Johns in his book Soundman. The legend is that Richards recorded the vocal because Jagger was in Australia filming Ned Kelly. However, the high-quality bootleg recordings of the Jagger vocal indicate that Richards' vocal was perhaps a deliberate choice after all. But it's a lovely melody, with Richards' affectionately tender, vulnerable vocals are complemented by this layered arrangement. Decorated with guitar and auto harp, Jones's last contribution to this band, and Nicky Hopkins, whose organ spreads a kind of celestial canopy above the song. You Can't Always Get What You Want is a sweeping and cinematic number whose inherent bleakness is somewhat offset by the angelic voices, chaste diction and rich harmonies. Those cathedral atmospheres juxtaposed with the song's mean streets. The number is lifted, of course, by Al Cooper's organ and piano lines and Jimmy Miller's swinging, syncopated drumming. It's a number that eddies and flip-flops between the hymnal and the weary fatalism of the lyrics. It's a song that sees the Stones glaring uncompromisingly into the 1970s, a decade that begins with the Kent State Massacre, Watergate, and syringes in the basement of the Villanelli cot. Exile indeed. I don't think the Stones ever planned for this album to be the tombstone of the 1960s. I think they were just trying to thrash out an album before their US tour began. And for the tour's climax, the Stones announced a free concert at San Francisco's Golden Gate Park. What better way was there to top Woodstock and sum up the 60s hopes and ideals, right down the street from Haight-Ashbury. But the dream was over and the concert got relocated to the Altamont Speedway, which was turned into a bit of a bloodbath. And the Stones dropped Let It Bleed the day before Altamont. I think if they sat down and listened to their own album, they would have known better than to show up. It seems the age of Aquarius was buried right next to Brian. Is this the Stones' darkest album? I don't know, but I do know the context casts some pretty gloomy shadows over it. But there you are, that's my review of the Rolling Stones' Let It Bleed. If you've enjoyed this, please do share it. Click like, subscribe, check that notification bell, do all that stuff. It's certainly much appreciated. And I leave you with my closing salvo, which is, as you know, hope you're well, staying safe, and of course that you keep listening.